Hello, Year Sixes, and welcome to History. My name is Mr. Graham, as you can see on the board. I am the Head of Humanities at King's Leadership Academy in Warrington, and I will be teaching some of you next year. Now, we have four different people who teach history in King's. There is myself, there is Mrs. Burrows, there is Mr. Hyde, and there is Miss Hannah. So you will be very fortunate to have one of the four of us teaching you next year. Obviously, we'll find out in September who you have. Everyone experienced teaching history. And yeah, you'll be very lucky no matter who it is that you have. So I thought what we'd start with is just a little bit of an overview as to what you can expect in history next year. Okay, so in year 7, or indeed in year 8, you will have about 2 hours of history a week. And our terms at King's are split into learning cycles. All of the learning cycles are about 7 weeks long, apart from learning cycle 5, which is a little bit longer. Now, in year 7, what you will study is when you first join us, you will do ancient Greece. Now, some of you may have studied a little bit about ancient Greece in primary school, but don't worry about that because we will be doing it again, essentially. Learning cycle 2, we studied the Norman Conquest. So that is William the Conqueror's Battle of Hastings 1066, taking control of England. Again, very interesting time period. Then we move on to medieval life in learning cycle 3, so that's just after Christmas. Learning cycle 4, we study Henry VIII, and I know again some of you will have studied Henry VIII already at primary school. And learning cycle 5, we do the English Civil War. So that's what you will study in your first year in history at King's. Now, in your next year, so in year 8, we go on to study the British Empire and the slave trade. Then we do the Industrial Revolution. Then we do World War I. Then we do the road to World War II. And finally, we do the civil rights movement in America. Now, that's obviously 10 completely different topics that we study in King's Leadership Academy in Warrington. They go in order of time. So that means they're chronological. Okay, so there's almost story to them. They all go in the order in which they occurred in history, from ancient Greece all the way up to the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. We try to get a lot of different things in there for you as well. So you've got some stuff in there from Greece, you've got some stuff in there from England, you've got some stuff in there from the Americas, all over the world. Now, if you decide then to take history at GCSE, a long way away already, I know, don't worry about that too much at the minute, you have 5 hours of history over the course of 2 weeks, rather than the 4 hours over 2 weeks. But that's nothing to worry about just yet, because obviously that's a long way away. But anyway, let's move on. So today we're going to do a brief lesson on ancient Greece, which, as I said, this will be the first lesson you will see in King's. Okay, so in every lesson in King's, we have a hypothesis. Now, that is like our title. What we do is we have to try and think of, is this hypothesis true or false or somewhere in between? So what you would usually do is you would usually write down the hypothesis with today's date, and then you would underline them. Now, the hypothesis for today is Greek society was full of flaws. Now, flaws are like things that are bad, like things that are wrong, perhaps. Things that aren't as wonderful about Greek society. So that's what that would mean. So Greek society is full of flaws. It's got lots of stuff wrong with it, essentially. Because sometimes the ancient Greeks are seen to be the most advanced society of the ancient world. Now, that's before the modern era, essentially. So in the BC era. And to be fair, they were incredibly advanced, but today we're just looking at their society, so the people in ancient Greece. Now, usually I would get you guys to discuss this and see how you thought about it, but we're going to look at this table and this map for a second. So remember that in BC, years move a little bit like minus numbers do. Now, if that confuses you a little bit, don't worry, we will go through that in your first few lessons at King's as well to make sure that you understand that. So, for example, the year 400 BC is further back in time than the year 338 BC. Now, let's have a look at how big Greece was at different points in time. If we go to 400 BC, Greece was lots of separate city-states. There was no individual country called Greece. Now, a city-state is essentially, there is one big city that controls all of the surrounding areas. In Greece, the most famous one of them would have been Athens. Now, you go ahead about 62 years in the future, you get Greece is now Macedonia and Greece. Now, that's following Greece and Macedonia being conquered by a king called Philip II. By 323 BC, however, it's now got Macedonia, Greece, Asia Minor, which you can, if you look on the map on the right-hand side of your screen, you will notice Asia Minor there. It's also got Egypt, which you can't actually see at this point. It's further south, and Persia. Okay, which again, further to the east. You can't really see that either. But so there's so much land that is conquered by Greece by 323 BC, or controlled by Greece by 323 BC, that you can't even see it on that massive map. It's amazing. However, 23 years after that, it's less again. So somehow it loses Asia Minor, Egypt, and Persia, and becomes only Macedonia and Greece again. And then by 146 BC, Greece doesn't even control itself. It's controlled by the Romans, who were from Italy. Well, modern day Italy. So that's kind of a really brief overview there. Okay, and you can see a lot of those city-states. If you look on the map, you can see around Greece, you can see like lots of little dots and things. You can see Delphi and Thebes and Athens and Corinth and Sparta. All of those are different cities and city-states. Now, let's continue on. Here's another map. This is obviously a much larger map. And what you will see in purple is the empire of Alexander the Great is actually what we see in 323 BC in that previous slide. So the empire of Alexander the Great is the largest that the Greek Empire ever became. It is when it controls Asia Minor, as we can see just in the east. You can see Persia extends all the way to some land. Obviously, you've got Egypt as well there. So a massive, massive empire that Alexander the Great got. But 23 years after Alexander's death, that empire has crumbled. It's not there anymore. And you can see just on this map a list of the different places that the Greeks owned. And in fact, Marseille in France was actually even a Greek colony at one point in time. So it's quite remarkable. The Greeks were able to conquer most of their known world at the time, which is phenomenal at the time. Now, a bit of background information for you then. The ancient Greeks lived in mainland Greece, so what we know as Greece today, as you would expect, and also the Greek islands. So again, we go back to this map. The Greek islands would obviously include areas like Crete, as you can see down at the very bottom. So there's islands there as well as part of Greece. But also in what is now Turkey. And in colonies. Now, a colony is an area of land controlled by another country. So it's not independent. It doesn't rule itself. It's controlled by another country. So, for example, Marseille is in France, but it was a Greek colony. It was controlled by the Greeks. And they were scattered around the Mediterranean Sea coast. Now, the Mediterranean, you can see here, if you can see the cursor. So this is the Mediterranean Sea in here. Okay. That's what you can see in there. It's the Mediterranean Sea. So all around here, as you can see all these little numbers here, and obviously down here and around here, was controlled by the Greeks. There were Greeks in Italy, Sicily, North Africa, and as far west, as we said, as France. Sailing the sea to trade and find new land, Greeks took their way of life to many places. What's interesting about this is it's not called Greece in the country itself, right? So the Greeks didn't call themselves Greek, or didn't call their country Greek or Greece. They called it Hellas, or Hellas. Hellas comes from Ellen, whose four sons in the mythology created the four great tribes that would make up ancient Greece. And you can see kind of their names there, Aeolus, and you've got Doris, Xuthus, and so far and so on and so forth. So Achaeus and Ion. You've got all of those different people making up different tribes. You can look a little bit. The thing is, with any of this information, if you find it quite interesting, you can go and you can look up some more information if you want to. So the name Greece, where does it come from? If the Greeks didn't call themselves Greek and they said they were from the country of Hellas, then where do we get the name from? Well, actually, it's the Romans. The term Greece comes from the name that the Romans applied to Hellas, which is they called it Graecia. While the people of Hellas thought themselves as Hellenes, the Romans called them by the Latin word, as I said, Grecia. So the Grecia, as you can see, Grecia, Greece. Sounds very similar, right? Okay, now, we're going to just skip over to something here for a sec. So I'm going to share this Greek society thing with you. So let's have a look at this. This is a bunch of information that we're just going to read through about Greek society, because that's our next step now. That's our next step, is to find out a little bit more about Greek society. So let's just zoom in. So the society of ancient Greece is largely composed of the following groups. 1, male citizens, which a citizen is somebody who is entitled to the full rights of the country. And they were put into 3 groups: landed aristocrats, or aristoi, as we will call them, the poorer farmers, and the middle class. The poorer farmers were sometimes known as dusty feet, but we'll get to that. It's quite interesting, that dusty feet. And then the middle class, who were artisans and traders. Then you've got semi-free laborers, women, women could belong to all of the male groups above. For example, they could be aristoi, they could be poor farmers, or they could be middle class, but they weren't, they didn't have citizen rights. And we'll look at that in a little bit, because women weren't allowed to vote. Children who were categorized as below 18 years generally, and they could fall under all of the categories you see. There were slaves who had civil or military duties, and then there were foreigners who were non-residents who were below male citizens in status. The Greeks believed that they were superior to all other peoples in the planet. So if you were not from Greece, you were not seen to be as superior as the Greeks. So let's have a read through this then as a group. Although the male citizen had by far the best position in Greek society, there were different classes within this group. Top of the social tree were the best people, the aristoi, as we mentioned before. They possessed more money than everyone else. This class could also provide themselves with armor, weapons, and a horse when on a military campaign. Because if you were a male citizen in Greece, it was expected that you would help your country or your city-state out by going to war. Now, if you were rich enough, you remember the aristoi, you can purchase all of these things. You can purchase armor, you can purchase weapons, you can get a horse. So you can imagine you're going to be far more effective in battle. The aristocrats were often split into powerful families, that's the aristoi, were often split into powerful family factions or clans who controlled all of the important political positions in the polis, the city. So these people, not only are they the wealthiest, but they also control all of the political power as well. Now, a lot of their money comes from having properties, owning land, and even more importantly, as I said, the best land. So the most fertile land and the closest to the protection offered by city walls. Now, fertile land means it's very good at growing crops. So a lot of these aristoi, they would have gained their money from having all of this land that was really fertile, could grow crops really easily, and then they could sell the crops, or they could rent the land out for people to work on. And also, if it's closer to the city, that means it's closer to the protection that the city has. So the city could send out its army to protect the people. However, if it's further away, obviously it takes the army longer to get there, so less protected. Next, we've got a poorer second class of citizens existed as well. These were men who had land, but perhaps less productive plots. So not as fertile land, didn't grow as much. It might have been a bit rockier, for example, so you can't grow as many like vegetables and things there. Their property was less well protected because it was a little bit further away from the city. Sometimes they're called the dusty feet as an insult to their low standing. So the aristoi would sometimes refer to these poorer farmers as being the dusty feet, because they tended to wear sandals, and in Greece it gets really warm, so the kind of soil dries out and becomes really dusty and dry, as you might have seen sometimes in the summertime. And their feet got really dirty. So the upper classes, the higher classes, more powerful and rich, called these poorer farmers, they called them dusty feet because of that, as like an insult. Now, the third group is kind of in between those two. It's in between the Aristoi and the Dusty Feet. They are the middle business class. So they're the ones who have they're the merchants. They sell stuff, for example. They take part in manufacturing, trade, and commerce. Now, however, the Aristoi, the kind of really high-ranking, very rich, jealously guarded their privileges and political monopoly, ensuring that only landowners could rise into positions of real power. So because these people tended to rent land, so they would say, if you were a blacksmith, so you made things out of metal, you made swords and armor, you might not own the land. That you're renting that land off somebody in the Aristoi, and the Aristoi are making sure that you might make some money, but you can never become as rich and powerful as those Aristoi could. Now, the key thing with this is none of these are set in stone. If you, for example, are a member of the Aristoi who falls on really hard times, or you fall out of favor, you could end up becoming a poor farmer if you're banished from the city. And we'd look at that in a different lesson. You could be ostracized via the ostracism. Well, we'll look at that in a different lesson whenever you guys join us in September time. Now, sometimes the business classes, those kind of that middle group, could make so much money they could move to the Aristoi. Didn't happen very often, but it could happen. And sometimes, again, as I said, the Aristoi could move the whole way down to the Dusty Feet. Now, that doesn't happen hugely often, but it is there. Now, all men had to complete military service, which means they all have to serve in the army. No matter how rich or poor you are, you go and serve in the army. Now, my suggestion for you guys is, by the way, is you can pause the video at any point here, and you can make notes down on who these different people were. So, for example, who were the Aristoi? Summarize it for me in one sentence. Who were the Dusty Feet? Summarize it in one sentence. And again, who were this middle business class? Summarize it in one sentence. Okay, let's move on to women then. Now, again, as I said, if you want to go back, just click back on the video, and you can pause it and so on and so forth. Now, I'm going to go through these ones now, and again, just feel free to pause at any point so you can catch up and make some notes. I would suggest maybe doing 2 sentences on women, at least. Okay, so let's read through this. Female citizens had a few rights in comparison to male citizens. They weren't able to vote, they were not allowed to own land, and they're not allowed to inherit, which means if somebody dies, they're not allowed to gain anything from it. They're not allowed to gain money or land themselves. It was believed that a woman's place was in the home, and her purpose in life was to rear children, so to bring up children. That's what the belief was in ancient Greece, was a woman would give birth, and then they would look after the children. Contact with non-family males was discouraged, and women occupied their time with indoor activities such as woolwork and weaving. So you weren't allowed to go and see men from other families. That was very, very much frowned upon. Now, there's only one exception to this, really. In Sparta, which is like it's a city-state in Greece, but it's known for having fearsome warriors. And that was a real exception because women were treated quite equally there. They have to do physical training like the men do, which is they don't wear any clothes when they do this physical training in combat because they want to get like as tough as possible, right? You might think it's a bit odd. I understand that. Now, they're also in Sparta, women are allowed to own land and they're allowed to drink wine. All right. Now, in Greece again, it's very different from the modern day. Women tended to marry at the age of 13 or 14. But you have to understand that part of that is because of the life expectancy. People weren't expected to live until their 80s like they are today. So if your lifestyle is maybe a little bit, if your life expectancy is a little bit shorter, then you might, move into adulthood earlier. A marriage could be cancelled. This is quite interesting. A marriage could be cancelled if the husband wanted it to be. So not if the woman wanted it to be, as long as the husband returned the dowry. Because what would happen whenever a woman would get married was the woman's family would pay the man for taking the woman off their hands. So if a husband wanted to cancel a marriage, could do as long as he paid the money back to his wife's family. Or sometimes the bride's father could ask for his daughter back after a marriage as long as she'd not had children with her husband. And that did happen a few times, because what would happen was the man and the woman would marry, and then the father of the woman would go, actually, no, I've been offered, I know that there's somebody else who's richer and more powerful who I could marry her to, so I'll cancel that, bring it back, and bring the woman back, and then remarry her to somebody else. bunkers, right? Bunkers. Now, young girls, their education was often based around making them good housewives in the future. So doing things like wool work, teaching them how to weave, knit. Again, if you want to pause here to make 2 or 3 sentences of notes on women, then that's absolutely fine. Next, we've got laborers. In Greek society, there was a significantly larger proportion of laborers than slaves. Now, laborers are people who do jobs, essentially. So we'll look at this here. These were the semi-free workers who were wholly dependent upon their employer. These people are not property and could not be sold. They would agree to give a certain amount to their employer and keep the rest to themselves. So essentially, they took in a certain amount. So laborers would do work. Again, it could be like a lower paid blacksmith. And what would happen is they would be employed by somebody to be a blacksmith. They would take money and they'd give a certain amount of that money to the people who they were working for. As you can imagine, it's kind of very similar. If you work in a shop today, right? You might take all this money into the tills, but you don't own that money. It's the person you're working for that owns that money. That's how it worked, and that's why they're called semi-free. Because unlike today, these people were entirely dependent upon the person they're working for. If the person they're working for cast them out, got rid of them, they could very much end up with no rights and have to sell themselves into slavery. Now, finally, slaves. Again, if you want to write a 1-sentence summary on laborers, feel free to pause there. Finally, slaves. In Greek society, slaves were seen as a necessary and perfectly normal part of city life. Acquired through war and conquest, kidnap and purchase, slaves were believed to be simply among life's losers in ancient Greece. So essentially, people could be taken from their towns. It could be the Greeks would defeat somebody in war and they take people as slaves, or you could simply purchase them. Some famous intellectuals, such as Aristotle, claim that slaves were obviously inferior as they allowed themselves to be put in the position that they were in. Because the Greeks believed that they were born to rule and slaves were born to serve. Now, obviously, that's not the case. There's no kind of scientific evidence to suggest that, but that's what the Greeks believed. They believed that they were so superior that anybody who was able to be captured by them deserved to be a slave. That's what the Greeks believed. Slaves were actually, there was a lot of slaves in ancient Greece. They made up, we don't know exactly how much, but it was somewhere between 15 and 40% of the Greek population were slaves. Every Athenian citizen desired slaves. Everyone who lived in Athens, it was the current capital city of Greece, desired slaves. Slaves did many jobs, from farming to building, and the richest citizens could own many slaves. Okay, so let's go back to these slides then. You got loads of stuff. Again, if you want to go back or pause, then obviously feel free to do that. Now, another task for you. I'm going to leave you with this final task. A few questions on the board that you can do. Can you remember who the different people were in Greek society? Test yourself. Can you remember them? What did they do? Who had the most power, do you think, and why? And then finally, how fair do you think Greek society was and why? All right. Is it similar to today's or not similar to today's? That's up to you. I'm going to leave you that question. I look forward to seeing all of you in September. Obviously, if you've got any questions, feel free to contact any of us. My email address is k.graham@kingswarrington.com. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing you in September for some awesome history. See you later, folks.